Let me give us a brief introduction for our guest speaker, Mr. Roop Singh. I think I mentioned to the class that Roop and I had the pleasure of working with Roop several years ago when we were working at SecureWorks, which is a cybersecurity subsidiary of Dell Computers. And Roop was there leading a very large project regarding operational efficiencies. So it was bringing in new software systems, figuring out new process, how the systems work together, and basically trying to do a process transformation kind of project at SecureWorks. And so certainly our conversations around that were very interesting, but what really fascinated me the most were the side discussions that we had and just getting to know Roop better. And then he started talking to me about this new technology with this real disruptive nature. I had no idea what he was talking about. He called it blockchain. And I remember thinking to myself, this guy is either some revolutionary, forward-thinking technologist, futurist, visionary, or he's absolutely crazy. I'm not sure which one, but I kind of shook my head a lot, had no idea what he was talking about. And obviously, just a few years later, it was the former and not the later, right? The latter, right? So you can't open a news report, you can't turn on CNBC or anything and not see talk about blockchain. It's probably the most popular topic behind COVID in the business world. Mm-hmm. So obviously, Roop was a visionary, and I should have been listening to him the whole time and probably should have invested in Bitcoin probably about 4 years ago. All right. So now to kind of the more formal introduction for Roop. And most of this is on the website that I posted in the link about Roop. So he's the founder and principal of a consulting firm that specializes in blockchain called Intuit Factory. He's a regular guest speaker at all types of different audiences, in universities, in corporate settings, and he's given some TEDx talks. He's actually started his own educational series for executives. So he teaches corporate leaders, and the title of his course he teaches is not so descriptive, is a bit descriptive: Blockchain Strategy for Business Leaders. He even has a new book coming out. Maybe he'll talk to us a little bit about that, called Profits in Chaos: Blockchain Strategy to Sow and Survive Disruption. And is truly a real visionary when it comes to this technology. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Mr. Roop Singh.
Thank you, Jason. Nice to see everybody. Good to see you again, Jason. We've had some wonderful conversations, and I should say it has been my pleasure to learn from you while we were at SecureWorks. And I think we both are glad we're not there anymore. So cheers on that. I have a lot to cover, so I will get into this right away. What I would like for you guys to think about is, how do you want to play in this space as we go through all these wonderful, interesting things, and figure out what is your role. So the title for today's lecture is Blockchain is Eating the World: Implications on Intellectual Property. What we'll cover: disruption, how it happens, the technology way, some recent trends in this space. Then we'll ground ourselves to what is blockchain, some very basic grounded definition that we all can follow and understand. The distinction between crypto assets versus the foundational technology of blockchain. And then we'll get into, when does blockchain make sense? We get asked this question a number of times. What is a good use case for blockchain? I'll give you an 8-principle framework to understand that. And then we'll get into some strategic frameworks on what can companies do, and what can you do, or what can blockchain do for you. And then we'll get into your world of intellectual property and the implications that blockchain is having on intellectual property. We will also get into some use cases or some companies that are developing those products for intellectual property using blockchain platforms. Then we'll get into 8 categories of predictions. And I will ask you, do you believe those predictions will come true? Those are mine predictions. We'll see if they happen, and it can validate Jason's original point. Either I'm crazy off my rocker or just happen to know a little bit about this space. We don't know. Then we'll end with, what are the challenges? Are we there yet? So first question for you is, and you can use your chat function to indicate where you are. On a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being beginner and 5 being expert, how well do you understand blockchain as a technology? And Jason, if you could just look at the collective view, I'm not watching the chat, and give me some feedback on where does the class land. It's about 67, 65 students in here, so let's see where everybody is.
Yeah, and it's looking like almost all ones and twos. I think there was only maybe 1 or 2 threes so far. So certainly on the beginner side of ones and twos.
Okay, so now closing poll 1 and going on to poll 2. On a scale of 1 to 5, how well do you understand blockchain as a strategy? Trick question.
And some of them are even answering zeros. I think the lowest was a 1 was the scale, but I think that is a good indicator for us. So they're almost all ones, but actually a couple of zeros there.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's fine. We all start somewhere, and this is why we're having this session, so you can move on from one to further understanding. Okay. Let's go back in time to 1860s. In the United States, it's a time of political turmoil. It's a time of war. It's a time where a lot of changes are taking place in this country. There was a way for messages for your paper mail to come from the East Coast of the United States to the West Coast of the United States. And it was done using horse buggies. It used to take about 25 days to send mail from East Coast to the West Coast of the United States. Then one day, an entrepreneur stood up a company called the Pony Express. What they did is they hired a number of 150 to 200 drivers, or riders rather, of horses, and they would ride about 100 to 150 miles each, and they would cross hard terrain of crossing between the coasts through Nevada, through Utah, through California, and they would arrive at their western location. And they cut the time to deliver mail from 25 days to about 10 days. And that was considered revolutionary at that time. Nobody thought it could be done. It was a legend story of American ruggedness and entrepreneurialism and things of that nature. And everybody hailed these riders. It was hard work. And people were just overjoyed that they could get their mail in 10 days' time. And it became a cultural phenomenon where in San Francisco, people would gather every morning to receive the newspapers from the East and news from the East in 10 days' time. Around the same time, in 1860, I believe, Congress passed a law to install telegraph poles and connect intercontinental distances between the United States coasts through telegraph. In I think 1862 is when October 24th is when the first telegraph message was sent between the two coasts. October 24, 1868. In 2 days' time, on October 26th, 1868, the telegraph after the telegraph was sent, the Pony Express shut down. It lost about $200,000 in that time's money, and it left all those riders jobless. That is the story of disruption, of making things obsolete, of making our way of life in some sense obsolete, or making processes obsolete. The first example of the Pony Express is an example of process improvement, but incremental improvement. We improved from 25 days to 10 days, and that was considered great. And then a disruptive technology came of that time called telegraph and made riders and the previous process completely obsolete, because you could now send messages in a few seconds rather than a few days. That is a familiar story. It's a familiar story in the retail world. If you look around, retail stores are closing. It's a familiar story of Blockbuster Blockbuster versus Netflix. It's a familiar story of journalism, of books, physical books versus online digital books, and hence the exhibit behind Jason. What are some things happening in the blockchain world? JP Morgan recently tested blockchain payments, or I should be specific, Bitcoin payments from satellites, literally out of this world. PayPal, one of the very well-known internet pioneers, now expanded into the crypto space and gotten into the UK market. In some time, you might be able to even do that in the United States using your Venmo app to transfer crypto from your friends in your class. This is one of the biggest news, in my opinion. It's been happening for a while. China creates its own blockchain-based cryptocurrency, which is a central bank issued cryptocurrency, first for a major economy. That will have geopolitical implications. They've been testing it for about 4 or 5 months now. And one of my predictions that you'll hear later is that everybody will be getting into this space, including the United States. We will have to respond to this challenge thrown by China. Closer to home, MasterCard and Island Pay launched the world's first central bank digital currency, even before China's, in fact. And they have linked it to a card, and they did it in Nassau, which is known historically as the pirate territory, and very friendly to these kinds of, very friendly regulatory regime to these kinds of innovation. You've all been hearing about NFTs recently. It's the latest trend, craze, and we're doing another event on NFTs. So if somebody's interested, let me know. I'll send you the invite for that. An original Banksy was sold for a lot of money. Grimes, the artist, also girlfriend of pioneer disruptor Elon Musk, sold about $6 million worth of digital art as NFTs. What are NFTs? Non-fungible tokens. These could be art, this could be music, this could be some other graphic image. This could be a shoe that has cryptographically generated art. It could be anything. A 10-second video clip was sold for $6.6 million. BBC, one of the most conservative institutions on this planet, has gotten into blockchain tokens or NFTs with Doctor Who collectibles. So if you're a Doctor Who fan, that is good news. And guess what? Tom Brady is launching an NFT company. And this is news just a few hours ago from last night. Looking on the startup side, Coinbase is going to be the first blockchain exchange or crypto exchange to go do IPO as a direct listing on NASDAQ. They are valued, and this is now a couple of weeks ago, at $68 billion, which at that time, two weeks ago, was about 53x multiple of their revenue, which is unheard of in the IPO space. Typical startup companies, guess what? Get what, Jason? 6 to 8x. If you're really good, maybe 10x. 53x. Just get your arms around that. And just a few hours ago, they released their latest revenue numbers, which is 1.8 billion in total revenue. So I bet that 68 billion valuation has even gone up today. And they go on IPO in a week's time, April 14th. And that will establish the equity market for blockchain and crypto-based companies. In regulatory news, here are some latest updates. So in 2020, the Office of the Comptroller of Currency, basically allowed for custody services for traditional banks to hold blockchain-based crypto assets in custody. And that opened the floodgates. It opened the floodgates for traditional banks to get into crypto custody, and in reverse, in crypto exchanges to become traditional banks. And as such, there are 4 companies that have applied to become that. One of them is mentioned here in the last segment. Protego intends to provide crypto services for its clients and become a federally regulated bank. And in fact, an Atlanta-based company and good friends of ours at BitPay are also going to become a federally regulated bank but a crypto bank or a crypto services bank, if you will. They're one of the 4 companies that have applied for that. So these regulatory developments have induced institutional engagement, which has been present, but not to that extent. It has been latent. So we've just exploded that space now. So now that you know what's happening in the world, the blockchain and digital assets, let's come to base understanding. What the heck is this thing people keep talking about? There's a lot of definitions. I use a very simple one. Blockchain is a cryptographically secured distributed ledger with a shared state. What does that even mean? That means that, let's say we 67, 70 odd people in this room had a set of transactions amongst us. Let's just use dollars for simplicity's sake. Let's say we were sending dollar transactions to each other, and we had a way of recording those transactions. Back when we started as a society, we used to write them on tablets, which was stone tablets or marble tablets. Then eventually we figured out a third-party institution called the bank. And we said, okay, I'm not going to keep record of my transactions or somebody else's. I can keep mine if I like, but the bank keeps a record, i.e. a ledger of all the transaction that happens between these 70 people in this class. And we will go to the bank and ask them every time we need to know what is the current status of truth. Give us the current set of transactions. And nobody will dispute that because we trust the bank and we say, okay, if the bank says this is the statement of truth. Have you ever had the situation where you had to go to the bank and say, listen, my set of transactions say X, but yours say Y, they don't match. Oh my God, who are we going to believe? So we outsourced or forwarded our trust to a clearinghouse called the bank, and they became the custodian of the truth. Now we're coming around full circle and saying, well, what about we keep a set of these transactions amongst us, meaning all the 70 people, we have a set of transactions. I send $20 to Jason, Jason sent it $50 to Margaret, Margaret sent it to Gina. And these set of transactions, we will now publish on metaphorically what I call a shared wall in front of us. So we can all look at what the transaction was, and moment is published, we all believe that it is the version of truth. We don't dispute it because we all have been participant in approving this transaction, and we now will believe this shared wall over anything else. That shared wall is nothing but, metaphorically speaking, a distributed ledger with a shared state. Shared state meaning you and I and everybody in this network has the same set or the same state of transaction in a given moment. We cannot dispute what those were. And that essentially is what is blockchain. So very simply, it's a distributed ledger with mathematical encryption. So if anybody asks you, this is the simplest way to describe it. And why we use encryption is the following, that once the transaction is published, it cannot be changed. It is considered to be quote unquote immutable. And that is why we can have trust on the chain as separate or as distinct from trust on a third-party clearinghouse, also known as banks. So moving on, this set of ingredients, basically distributed ledger and encryption, had existed for many years. Distributed ledgers or distributed computing generally had existed since the 70s, and even more advanced research was going on it when internet came around in the 90s. Encryption has existed since we fought wars over, 5,000 years ago, with ciphers and smoke signals and things of that nature to encrypt messages so that we ensure it gets to the end receiver of the message without being distorted or without being read. So in 2008, somebody called Satoshi Nakamoto, a pseudonym, I'm not sure if it is one person or a group of persons, if it is a he or a she, put together a white paper which they combined these two ingredients that existed for a long time in a very innovative way, which they called Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system, which enabled transfer of electronic cash or digital currency from one person to another without a third party called the bank. This is from the original Bitcoin white paper. You should read it. It's very interesting. It's a short white paper. So then we arrive at this point, which is a big confusion for a lot of people, including a lot of CEOs that I talk to, because the way the news is, because the way things are hyped, a lot of people confuse cryptocurrencies or crypto assets with the underlying foundational technology of blockchain. So the simplest way to understand is Bitcoin, or any cryptocurrency for that matter, is one use case or one application of the foundational technology called blockchain. Not going to spend too much time on it, but you can see the distinctions. So if we have to categorize use cases of the foundational technology, as I mentioned, cryptocurrency is just one use case, and they all differ in their functionality as well. And we can get into distinctions in how one cryptocurrency is distinct from the other. Namely, you could have a more efficient one where transaction speed is higher, or you could have one where there is more privacy. For example, Zcash is more private than Bitcoin, which is pseudo-anonymous. And I guess this will help you in your privacy discussions, Jason. So there's a number of different types of cryptocurrencies. The last count I remember seeing somewhere is 5,600 plus cryptocurrencies that exist today. One of my predictions is they're not all going to survive. Then there are other type of tokenized crypto assets. So real estate, all the physical things that we see around us will eventually be tokenized into blockchain-based digital assets, and real estate is one of them. The building, the room you're sitting in, the building you're sitting in, can be converted into a digital twin and can be sold on secondary exchanges as a real estate token. Commodities would eventually be crypto assets. Example of fine art being crypto assets, we've seen all these NFTs, non-fungible tokens, being sold. So one distinction between cryptocurrencies and tokenized crypto assets is also that one is fungible, meaning one Bitcoin is the same as another Bitcoin. It could be exchanged or replaced with another Bitcoin. There's not a difference in the two. Wherein a non-fungible asset is unique in the sense that it cannot be exchanged. One piece of collectible or fine art is distinct from another piece of fine art. And then we get into industry use cases. You'll see later in the presentation, a number of industries are being disrupted using blockchain, and all of these that I've mentioned here: healthcare, automotive, financial services, health, insurance, manufacturing, mining, education, government, media, retail, telecom, transportation and logistics, identity. All of them have a lot of number of use cases that are being done through blockchain. So one of the games I play in my longer courses is blockchain bingo. You tell me a use case, and you tell me an industry, and I'll tell you a use case. So take a look at this. Of all the people that think that the current status quo is how the world should be, did you know that gold as an investment in these United States was illegal till 1974, which is not that far ago? So the reason I bring this up is there are times when new asset classes do emerge, and this is one of those times. So moving on, taking a breath here. If you have any questions, write them down or put them in the chat, and I'll take them in the end. When does blockchain make sense? What are top 8 principles to think about? As Jason mentioned earlier, I come from the world of automation or business process automation. And what I found fascinating at that time was all the techniques, all the approaches, the ways we were trying to automate processes in big companies, they were not effective. And what blockchain does, it forces you to automate. It forces you to figure out what's your network, who should be on that network? Who are your valuable supply chain partners? Who adds value and who does not add value? And remove the ones that do not add value, only play with the ones that you believe do add value. And a lot of that value is being replaced by the chain itself. So blockchain is business process automation. One of the quotes I remember from somebody is, you can only have so much fun alone on a blockchain network. It is a network. So you have to have a network of entities, be it individuals, a peer-to-peer type network, or be it a company partner type network. But you have to define that network. And then once you start thinking about applying blockchain to it, you will find that you have to make the network very efficient. You have to make the process very efficient. And blockchain, with its consensus mechanisms, forces that automation. It allows us what we discussed earlier, immutability, which further allows us auditability and provenance. We can prove when the transaction happened and who were the parties involved and what the transaction was. And that gives us a very interesting thing that hasn't been given before, is a shared set of truth amongst the network participants who can read or see those transactions. It also forces decentralization in some ways. We've talked about the centralized model of transactions using a bank, but look around the world, most of the world is centralized. There are centralized agencies, be it government agencies or corporate agencies, that do most of our transactions. And now we're getting to a world where it increasingly becomes more decentralized. Another way to think about this, what I talk about here is decentralization of network, but another interesting way to think about this, and this will be relevant to you folks, the same way YouTube decentralized content creation or Instagram decentralized content creation. Once these apps were available, anybody could be a content creator. Anybody could be a comic or a dancer or any kind of actor, and they could put up their own content. That space was reserved by studios before, which was a centralized model. And suddenly we live in a decentralized model now, and it's furthermore decentralized by TikTok. Disintermediation, we mentioned this before, but the idea that there are middlemen who particularly do not add value. They will be disintermediated, they will be removed. I'll give you an example. If you're a company that's only job is to move money from one end to the other without really adding any value in the middle, maybe you take a little bit of risk and you get paid for it. Those are the type of companies that will be removed from this chain. Why? Because they're not needed. I can trust the blockchain and not have to deal with middlemen. And a lot of industries are going to suffer from this. And if you want to use the word suffer, to me, it's just a natural way of disruption by technology. Immutability also gives us proof of ownership, and we'll talk a lot more about that in the subsequent half. If you think of a plot of land, especially in developing countries, I don't know if you guys have dealt with this, but how are land or even buildings registered? They are registered in some dark office in some corner on a paper-based ledger, and you write your name, and let's say it's your great-grandfather that owned that house, and this is a true story in my case. The great-grandfather owned the house, was passed on to father and then to son, but there is no official record of it unless you go find that one dusty ledger in some municipal office somewhere in some dark corner. And even that too, there's a lot of fraud that happens. Somebody could just erase that or replace that page, and boom, you have a new record and somebody else owns the house. So blockchain allows us to create a proof of ownership, and that'll be handy in all titles, be it for property or real estate or land, or be it for automotive, or be it for your phone, or be it for your intellectual property, which brings us to proof of authorship. Whose idea is it anyways? Wait, this is my idea. Well, how the heck do you prove that? And you guys being lawyers are very well familiar with that space. How do you prove that? Blockchain allows us for a way to prove that. And we'll get into more detail in a minute there. So eventually, this leads to transparency. We can see through the set of transactions. We can see through what's happening, which was not possible in the opaqueness of the centralized world. We had to believe what the centralized authority told us. And in a lot of ways, those details were not even published, which eventually leads us to trust. Transparency and trust in an increasingly automated world. That's what blockchain allows us to do. So when somebody comes to you and asks for, is this a good use case for blockchain? Think of these 8 principles and let you grasp that for a second. Are you satisfying these 8 principles, or at least some of them, that makes it for a useful, valid, feasible blockchain use case? Moving on. So to me, blockchain is not merely just a technology. To me, it's a strategy. What can blockchain do for you? Let's take a look at this framework. On the tactical side, blockchain can help reduce technical debt and replace inefficient legacy processes residing in multiple legacy systems. On the strategic side, it can redraw verticals and enable new business models and even get your products into new markets. In fact, develop new markets. That's what we're seeing now. All these crypto exchanges that you see, or all the NFT marketplaces that you see, they are purely new markets that have not existed in the past. So when you think of deploying blockchain, you must think of what is the extent of use I'm going to get from them? Is it more tactical, which is fine, or is it more strategic? The more you go strategic, the more you will find, if you're working for a company, that you have to expand your vision, your lens, to end-to-end processes across your supply chain partners. You cannot do blockchain implementation and call it strategic in one little department. That would be more of a tactical implementation. Here's another view of what blockchain can do for you. You'll see in the middle there, it can protect intellectual property, or it can verify, monitor any asset, be it physical asset or a digital assets chain of custody. Or it can transfer digital or physical assets over the internet. And we are essentially moving, and blockchain is allowing us to move from an era of internet of data and internet of agreements to internet of value. We'll talk about that more in a second. So let's get to your favorite space, blockchain's implication on intellectual property. So we've discussed a couple of these categories of use cases, but here's the 2 main ones that appeal to me. Blockchain can be used as a digital certificate. It can be used as an effective time stamping tool, and that has multiple implications. It could be used for defensive patenting or defensive publishing, or it can be used in a way to provide a proof of evidence of a particular digital asset existing. So let's say I have an NFT and it's on the chain. I can prove that I have an NFT by the timestamp and my ownership of that asset. On the other hand, if we were to talk about art or music or a song or even research papers, right? So these days, there's use cases being developed where you could put your initial ideas onto blockchain, get a timestamp, so you have defensive publishing or defensive patenting option later. The second is what we discussed slightly earlier. It's an intellectual property registry. So blockchain with smart contracts, and we really haven't talked about smart contracts as a technology, but think of that as an add-on layer onto blockchain, where smart contracts have the business logic or automated business logic that could be invoked at any time. That combination can become essentially smart intellectual property global registries. So in a way, think about this. I believe all patents in patent offices essentially will become blockchain-based smart IP registries, right? And then furthermore, how do you transfer those IP assets? It could be a way to transfer intellectual property assets, as I described in NFTs. NFTs could be a song or a video or an art collectible or anything. And then we also have a way of ensuring payments or even royalties on intellectual property assets using either crypto or even fiat currency for that matter. Once you can have a smart contract that allows for royalty, and there are those developed already, you can transfer royalties or collect royalties on your intellectual property. One of the challenges in the art world today is the first artist or the original artist makes a piece of art, sells it to a buyer. Now the buyer owns it. Now the buyer can sell it to the next buyer, but what did the first artist, the original artist, get out of it? Nothing. He just made the money on the first sale, nothing on the subsequent ones. So once we have technology in place where royalties could be transferred and collected over a course of a lifetime of an asset, that will completely change the game. Think of music. We went from centralized agencies called record companies minting a lot of money through artists and not giving them a lot back in the 70s. Then we came to an era of peer-to-peer file transfer with Napster and the like, the peer-to-peer networks, right? Then we came to a world of iTunes, where iTunes would hold the intellectual property or rights of that song and could play, and maybe they would give something back to the artist. I'm not sure. Then we came to the streaming world, where that became a little bit more efficient. We can count the number of times a song was being streamed through Spotify or Apple Music or any of these devices. Now we're coming to a peer-to-peer distribution of songs in this example, where we can not only count more effectively how many times the song was being played, but also ensure that royalties are being passed on back to the original set of creators of that song. So a quick look at the blockchain IP regulatory landscape, mostly in the US, but also an example or a development from China. So in Vermont in 2016, there was a legislation passed declaring the blockchain receipts accompanied by a written declaration of a person attesting to the details of the transactions are admissible. In Delaware in 2017, there was a law amended to allow organizations to maintain business records.
I mean, it's getting hot now, right? I'm good. Yeah, it's getting hot. I'll be fine.
I'm sorry, could you mute yourself, please?
Retainer things, yes.
Hey, Owen probably can't hear us.
Could you mute yourself? Thank you. So coming back to Delaware, a law was passed to allow organizations to maintain records using distributed electronic records or databases. In Arizona and Ohio, similar laws were amended where blockchain records and signature and smart contracts, which we may not be denied legal effect, validity, or enforceability. And that is interesting. Owen, could you please mute yourself? Thank you. In China, and this is a very interesting one, is where there was authenticated evidence in a copyright case used by the plaintiff, in which the plaintiff used the third-party blockchain deposition service to secure online web page evidence of the alleged copyright infringement. This goes back to the two categories of use cases we just talked about IP. This was the first court to do so in the country, and I think this will become a normal thing, especially for copyright enforcement, which you lawyers know is much more difficult than even patent enforcement. So now let's look at some companies that have already been in the space and developing use cases for intellectual property using blockchain. Bernstein, that is one of the most advanced companies in my most advanced product, in my opinion. Although I should put this disclaimer, me mentioning these companies in this presentation does not account or any type of endorsement of them or their products or the efficacy of their product. I'm not a lawyer, but I think that disclaimer is good enough. So look at Bernstein. They have a functional product with revenue today, and it is a way for even common people to register any type of IP using a blockchain platform. Lexit is another one of those. It's an M&A marketplace. And this is an interesting space which has not been talked about much. It goes back to monetization of royalties, as I was talking before. There's now a way to fractionalize one's IP by breaking IP into subparts or sub-design and then being able to monetize it. GoChain, use case on copyrights with digital content from music to pieces of art. Loki, that's another one of those very interesting ones where it's essentially what we build up to now, decentralized patents and inventions. You can register your patents on Loki. And it also allows for searching and analyzing patents, much more easier than today's world or today's process of doing so. This could become a global patent platform or patent registry. Open Music Initiative is a nonprofit exploring blockchain to identify the rightful music owners. So when music is created, there are a lot of designers or musicians or artists that are not given their due share. This is countering that issue. MusicCoin is a blockchain-based streaming platform. I already mentioned the streaming use case. Mycela is similar to other ones where it's a blockchain-based database created to ensure that artists are paid fairly. Vibrate is the world's largest music database, use blockchain to manage crowdsourced data and reward community participants. That's also very interesting. An artist is as successful as their community. So the community can be rewarded. You can become part of the artist's success by participating in a token or in their distribution of their music, where you become part of that adventure, not just being a spectator, but a player in it. Audio Music is a platform that allows original works to be self-published and control licensing option and distribution option of music ownership. Binded is another copyright registration platform. So now you see the category of use cases, and these are real companies that have been working to bring this to the world for quite a few years now. MediaChain, I think MediaChain was acquired by Spotify. Yep, acquired by Spotify in 2017. So that tells you how important that streaming use case is going to be. Spotify is the biggest, or one of the biggest streamers, and they acquired MediaChain to ensure that they have a way to play in this space. So a number of industries are being disrupted that are in the path of this train. I'll let you take a look at these set of industries. This is just to show you, coming out of the intellectual property lens now, just to show you a wider lens that blockchain is really eating the world. Anything you can think of, there's a blockchain use case for that. Blockchain alone is not enough. I don't believe that blockchain alone can solve the world's problems. I've never believed that. That sets me apart from a lot of the over-exuberant enthusiasts in the crypto space. I believe that this will be the stack of technology platforms or technologies being used for business applications of the future. We will have a bottom layer of blockchain platforms, depending on a degree of decentralization. I don't think we will have fully decentralized platforms. Bitcoin is probably the most decentralized platform in the world. I don't think we will see that, but to a significant degree decentralized. Underlying blockchain platform to share data securely and immutably. Then we will have smart contracts to execute business logic automatedly. Then we would layer that with augmented and virtual reality, with artificial intelligence, with data analytics and business intelligence. So that's the stack I see technology or business applications employing in the future.
Hey, Rup, this is Jason. So we may start losing students in about 5 minutes or so. I think you said
We're
you may
almost
be
there.
available to stay a little after. So I didn't know if you wanted to address, I know one of the students had put a question in to the chat box. Did you want to keep going here with your presentation, or do you want to take a shot at this question that the student had asked?
Let me do these 2 prediction slides and then we'll cover the question. We're almost done.
Perfect, thanks.
All right. So where will we end up? Blockchain is eating the world. All trade, finance, and retail payments will be executed on smart contract and blockchain-based infrastructure. All physical and virtual assets around us will be monetized as tokenized digital blockchain-based assets. All securities, stocks, bonds, real estate, private funds, commodity are now blockchain-based digital securities. This is the world we're going to live in. And they have thriving secondary or even primary digital security exchanges for them. We've lived in Web 2.0, the current world. We will live in Web 3.0, where cloud computing will be evolved to always on computing using blockchain. Distributed ledgers are the underlying secure data sharing layer for all critical IoT, Internet of Things, and autonomous devices, autonomous cars, etc., and drones data. Multiple blockchain distributed networks and protocols exist for each use case. What that means is you'll have some for IP, we'll have some for healthcare, we'll have some for supply chain, some for media, some for gaming, etc. Here's a big one, accounting function. The function of accounting is no longer done by humans, but done by blockchain-based platforms and networks. All supply chains will have their chain of custody of asset tracked onto a blockchain network. Identity and intellectual property, all forms of identity, be it government issued identity or company issued identity, or our biometric and genetic identity, are managed via blockchain based network. All forms of titles, as we mentioned before, automotive, vehicle, real estate, art, music, video, graphics, etc., are managed through a blockchain based platform. Blockchain platforms become a de facto registry, a global registry for intellectual property and copyright. Crypto, we will have a new set of crypto rails and crypto infrastructure distinct from the current set of financial institutional infrastructure with a distinct set of players. That's huge. We're developing new set of infrastructure and parallel markets using crypto. The architecture of money is changing. We will live in a world where we will have private stable coins or private currencies issued by companies, and we will also have central bank issued digital blockchain-based currencies, and that is induced by geopolitical struggles or power struggles, and that will further fuel these power struggles geopolitically. So eventually, we will end up at an internet of value from today's internet of data and agreements. So a poll question for you while I look at the chat questions is, how much do you believe that Roop's predictions will come true? Option 1, Roop is off his rockers. He needs to take his medication and he is actually crazy as Jason described him to be. Option 2, unlikely that they will come true, but perhaps. Some will come true, most or all of them will come true. So use your chat box to indicate your level of belief in these predictions. Jason.
Yeah, so it looks like mostly 3s and 4s. Nobody has been brave enough to say number 1 here.
I guess they're shy now.
Or you've made a convincing case, one or the other.
Right. So I'll answer the question while we're still on the poll. The answer is yes, it becomes an immutable mistake, but there is a precursor to that. There are a lot of checks and rules and business logic implemented that happens before the transaction is published. So let's say in the case of just Bitcoin and transferring of digital cash, there's a set of rules that the transaction has to go through what is called the consensus mechanism. And all the validators of the network have to agree that this is in fact a true, authentic, genuine, valid transaction before they allow it to quote unquote publish onto the chain. Okay, so just wrapping up the presentation. This is a code I wrote in 2017. You can take a look. It just makes me look smarter than what I already am. So this is to confuse you rather than to convince you, but take a look at it. Just wrapping up in the interest of time. My book, Profits in Chaos, Blockchain Strategy to Sow and Survive Disruption, about to come out. You can go to profitsinchaos.com to sign up for early updates and release details. We will keep you posted. And we can continue the conversation. This is my link tree. I'll post it in the chat box as well. We can continue this conversation and answer your questions even on LinkedIn, etc. So thank you for having me, Jason. I'm open for questions now.
Yeah, so it looks like there might be another question in the chat box. Can transfers be made of different currencies, dollars to euros and things outside of basically how to use blockchain for more traditional types of currencies rather than just cryptocurrencies?
Yeah, so great question. Look at company BitPay, and there are quite a few others that do the fiat, we call the traditional currencies fiat currency. So that do the fiat to crypto translation or conversion, if you will. The other aspect to think about is how do bank-to-bank transfers occur. So you guys read the Ripple case. Ripple and R3 are two companies that have developed blockchain-based bank-to-bank transfer mechanism. So they transfer dollars or whatever national currencies they deal with, but it is done not through the SWIFT network, that is the current financial adopted infrastructure to do those transfers, but new blockchain-based transfer mechanisms or platforms that these companies have developed, R3 and Ripple. And I will not comment on Ripple, apart from saying that that case is important for us in the US to get some clarity on what the regulators would do in these cases.
So Rup, I had a question I was starting to type out in the chat, but maybe it's easier if I just ask. So when you're talking about the multiple platforms, all right, so even in the IP space, you just listed a dozen, or you probably could have put more slides on and had 2 dozen or 3 dozen companies that are all coming up with different types of platforms just in the IP space. So if we go into any of the industries, we're going to have multiple players. Do we need some kind of shakeout and consensus on this is the platform, or these are the couple of platforms, so that we have, so if I want to do a transaction with you and we say we're going to put it on the chain, which chain, where are we going? How does that platform gain enough traction, so to speak, that it becomes dominant and we have confidence in it?
Right. So let's go back to 2000s. I have 3 words for you: MySpace, Friendster, and Facebook. So the answer to your question is there will be consolidation. All of these companies are looking for adoption. Whoever gets the most adoption can make that claim and make that play. And this is happening across different layers, if you will, at the protocol layer, at the application layer, at the network layer, which is the same as protocol layer. So we don't know who the winners are going to be, but there will be winners and there will be losers. And that's the game that's being played now. It's a game of who can raise more money, who can find more utility for those use cases, or you can find use cases that are more utilized for platforms, that is, or who can get a more ecosystem adoption in developers, more community support, or who can find more adoption from end users, which would be the case for the IP type platforms. So, this is what we do in research in comparing these companies. and figure out which one is going to be a winner. But there are no clear winners yet, but there definitely will be. And as I predicted before, there'll be a lot of consolidation in this space. A lot of companies will be bought. A lot of these companies will not even remain in 5 years. But I can assure you that the same way internet led to the Amazon and Google and Apple and Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp, these category or these, dominant players, de facto platforms, if you will, for their use cases, the same way we will find de facto dominant platforms within the 8-10 year time frame in this space.
Thanks. Don't know if
Any
you can
other thoughts, comments, insults, questions?
I don't know if you can see the chat. Looks like another one. You mentioned that with the use of blockchain, users will have more control and consent over their data. How would that work?
Yeah, so shameless plug, watch my first TED Talk in TEDx Atlanta. The title was Who Owns Your Digital Identity? And this literally was the topic. My belief is you as a user have a natural and organic rights to your data. And there are platforms being developed now that allow you such. So I would go on a limb here and say companies like Equifax, who collect data about us, should not exist, or they should only exist in a way where we give them permission to collect data about us, and then we can take away permission. We can revoke our rights to allow that data. And that, to me, is how we will eventually arrive at that place where users will have control. And that's a war. That's a big war right now. If you look at Facebook, they just collect our data and essentially use it for advertising purposes. Is that ethically right? It's a dominant business model. It's made a lot of money to a lot of people. I think a lot of people are not happy about that. Over the last 3-4 years, we've seen that. And I'm not the first or the only one to say that. There's a whole movement around it. So there is this concern around users need to have more ownership of their data. And furthermore, that business model associated with that data needs to change. So for instance, let's take an extreme view. If my genetic data is being sold to somebody, even for medical research, it is literally my genetic data, and hence I have natural and organic rights to it. I should be participant in its monetization after I have given control and approval for it to be used for the purpose that I have given the approval to be used. And I should have a way to revoke that control and revoke those rights back if I'm not inclined to do at that time. So point being, there are platforms being developed. It's a struggle, but we will eventually get there.
So I guess, Roop, to follow up with that question, that what you're saying about your rights in your own data and to participate in monetization of it and the ability to correct it if it's wrong, revoke permissions, things that you might see like in the GDPR about your ownership of your data. I guess the question is, how does blockchain change that in some way? Is it different to say, I own something that's more easily removed or I have better control over it through blockchain than I do just in a database that's sitting somewhere, a more traditional database? Is there a way that blockchain helps us track that better? Yeah,
so you inherently answered the question. Blockchain is a more effective technology to implement GDPR. That's what I argue in the TEDx talk as well. So the issue is we have the user, we have companies who have a legitimate need for this data, right? I'm not even saying don't collect the data. And then we have regulators who need to prove who has the data and who's allowed to use it for what purpose. So what blockchain is a technology in the middle that can solve for all these constraints or all these users' intentions and their needs. So just think of the world where all data is issued or published on some kind of a blockchain network. Now, let's just take music rights, right? Music rights, or actually let's take art because that's an easier example to understand. So first artist created a painting, now it needs to be sold to somebody. But what is he selling? Is he selling the art or is he selling the rights to sell it further? that can be recorded on a smart contract. And once that's recorded, let's say buyer one then becomes the seller and sells it to buyer two, that can be recorded as well. Today, there's no one truthful, authentic way to do that. The databases that you talk about originally were databases sitting in centralized agencies. In this case, some auction exchange, or in the case of music, some record company. So that's why we had these arguments. Now we can have even almost a public registry for intellectual property where transferring of rights becomes an easier thing. And I know of some companies and some frameworks are being developed to do that even on your mobile data, something as itemized, or so, as simplified as your mobile data, your geolocation data, your mobile tracking of your mobile activity. All that can be done in that way. Does that help answer the question?
Does for me. Let's see if there's any other.
I had a question that I wanted to, I guess, ask via voice. So kind of couldn't really figure out how to wait up. But kind of going a little bit off that. So you were talking about how with this blockchain, like there'd be more authentication of like identity and all that kind of stuff. And my question was kind of about like taxes and like automated payments for like mortgages, things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think those things will become more automated, like in the sense, for example, like with taxes, like your taxes might be like automatically paid, since I guess that data is like more secured and like already in place and stuff, and like perhaps you wouldn't have to like go through the whole process each year of like filling out all the information for the IRS and things like that?
Well, I don't think you will ever get away from IRS. But to answer your question, so this is happening in the crypto space already. Because crypto has become such a large volume trading mechanism now, or trading asset class, last few years there have been automated accounting platforms that have come up. One is based out of Atlanta called Veride. I've heard of a couple of others. I've used a couple of others myself. When you trade crypto back and forth, sometimes the transactions are so much, I don't even know what capital gains I made or didn't make, because there's just too many transactions to count. It's not straightforward. So you put those transactions in this software and it tells you, this is your tax liability for this year. Cheers, thanks, that's what I needed to know. And you just attach that form to your, or put that entry in your 1040 or whatever form you're submitting, and then attach that form as a proof that we did this calculation using so and so software, and you're done. So there is an automation on the tax side that's happening already. The second thing I will point out is the following. This idea came around when the pandemic started, and I actually believe that this is in line with CDBCs, or central bank digital currencies, as we talked about before. Imagine a time where the federal government or the treasury of the federal government will issue you digital wallets. So today, the federal government or the treasury interacts to you or with you through financial institutions, also known as banks. So if you ever got a PPP loan, you had to go through a bank. And the bank had the choice to accept your application or not accept. That was a big uproar when the first stimulus package was announced. So what this digital wallet does, it cuts through all the middlemen and says, I'm a federal government and you are the citizen of my country and you have a wallet. I can interact with you directly. If I want to send you a $1,400 payment to your, or stimulus payment to you, rather than going through Bank of America or Wachovia or SunTrust or whatever, I put it in your digital wallet directly. Now, what that does, it also allows them to monitor your use of the digital wallet. And in fact, if you imagine a time when all the transactions that you do go through your digital wallet, that digital wallet could be your base wallet to transact through other financial institutions. So all your money activity is being tracked. And then perhaps the digital wallet also gives you an estimate of your tax at the end of the year. Futuristic world, not there yet.
it seems to kind of help with tracking paper trails of like crimes and stuff, I guess. It would be like
Well,
impossible to hide a paper trail if it's all digital and recorded. I
yeah,
think.
you can stop a lot of fraud.
I'm curious what cyber threats are going to present themselves from a blockchain, kind of the future that you're saying you see with it taking over all these different industries. If there were to be a hack, would they be able to see private information on people on each end of the transaction? And if there were a hack, would they be able to change what you've described as an unchangeable register of what's happened?
Yeah. So brilliant question. There are 3 or 4 thoughts that I have. The first one, there is this notion that blockchains are unhackable. Not true. Blockchain are more tamper resistant, but they are not unhackable. Let's put it that way. When can or how can they be hacked? Let's take an example of a fully decentralized network like Bitcoin. To hack it, you would need more than 51% of the network's hash power, which is essentially its computing power. Can some entities have that? It's very unlikely unless there is a nation state that launches a dedicated attack on the Bitcoin network. Just because now we are so decentralized, or in other words, there are so many networks as part of the nodes of that, so many nodes as part of that network that it would need 51% of the network hash power, any bad actor would, and it's not easy to generate that given how decentralized we are. That's point one. Can smaller or less decentralized blockchains be hacked? The answer is yes, and that is a big concern for smaller cryptocurrencies, and that's why I don't think they will survive as much, because if their market cap is too small and their nodes in the network are too less, their hash power is too less, any private entity could launch an attack on it. So there is that risk. What else did I have in mind? Yes, the question of changing attributes. So this is the interesting difference between a centralized model and a decentralized model. In a centralized model, we say, okay, Mr. Bank, you keep my information, or Facebook or whoever, you keep my information, and they typically end up keeping it in a centralized way, which is literally metaphorically saying, you have a vault with a name written on it, and you present to the hacker, here is all the data, I dare you to take it. And sometimes they take it. Just a couple of days ago, there was a release on Facebook's hack, which happened a couple of years ago, but now the information is available, that data is available on the dark web for sale. So these things happen. And I start my TEDx talk on this topic mentioning 4 or 5 of these different hacks, including Equifax. Hence, again, they should not exist because they couldn't protect our data, which they collected without my knowledge, without your knowledge either, or consent for that matter. So what is the antidote? The antidote is to put your eggs in different baskets. In a way, decentralize it. So look at Filecoin and storage, 2 examples where they're essentially memory marketplaces. But the idea behind that protocol is if you want to store something, let's say you want to store a book, you don't put the book in one place. You break the book into a million pieces, and only the protocol knows where those pieces are stored. So even if the hacker can find 1, 200 pieces, they cannot put the whole book together, so to say, right? So that's the advantage of decentralization. And then you layer on encryption on top of that. Even if they found the 100 pieces, they need to have a key to de-encrypt or to decrypt the information in the text in the book. And unless you have the key, you won't be able to read it. So that further mitigates the risk of this information being compromised. Hence, I believe all information, so I'll give you a stark example. We're walking through airports these days, our pictures are being taken, and for decent purposes, for good use cases, I believe, but where is that data being sold? Take COVID, we're getting all these vaccinations. Where is our vaccination records being stored? What is the underlying storage for all the private data that's being collected on me and you, all the video, all the CCTV cameras that we see around? Where is that data being stored? The entity says, well, we will keep it safe, but there is a huge history that says, no, you can't, because you're not following a decentralized model. And why should I trust you? So trust on the chain versus trust on a central entity keeping that data safe. Then let me add the third or fourth point to it, which is a caveat. When, and this is futuristic thinking, when quantum computing arrives here in a mainstream way, all these bets are off. Meaning all the encryption and the protocols that we see today in the blockchain space are designed for today's computing power, for today's computing sophistication, if you will. Well, when quantum computing arrives here in a meaningful, it is already here, but in a meaningful way, or in a cheaper way, in fact, then we will have to update all these protocols to be quote unquote resistant to quantum computing. And what would happen is eventually a lot of these nodes of these networks that we talk about will eventually be quantum computers that can fight other quantum computing power. That's just the future.
Oh
Thank
boy, that might be a good one to end on. So I said that a few years ago, Roop was talking to me about a concept I didn't understand called blockchain. He's now moved into quantum computing, which is the new concept that I don't understand and what he's talking about. So maybe we will have to check in with Roop in a few years and see whether or not his predictions on quantum computing are as accurate as his predictions have been on blockchain, or if in fact he has gone off his rocker in a couple of years. So with that, what I want to do is just thank Roop again for coming to talk to everybody. This has been fantastic. And I'm really looking forward to getting the feedback directly from the students on Friday, and we can have a chance to talk about some of these concepts and then tie it back to some of the material that I had asked the students to take a look at coming into the presentation, some more of the legal issues around some of the topics. It'll be really fascinating. So again, thank you, Roop. And we really appreciate it and look forward to keeping in touch.
Thank you so much for having me, Jason. Enjoyed talking to the class. You guys are wonderful. Thank you for being a very informed and engaged audience. We can continue our conversation. I've posted my link tree. Feel free to check out all the aspects there and keep in touch on LinkedIn.
Good.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks. Ciao.
Thanks,
Thank
Jason.
you.
Take care. Bye-bye.